Surgeon General coming out and saying that social media needs a warning label.
I agree.
And bill passed in New York that limits how social media companies can interact with kids. And I just saw Newsom's got...
Yeah, California is moving to ban phones in schools.
Yeah. Let's do a quick flash, more or less poll. Who's more banning phones in schools?
I'm more, for sure.
You're more?
Elad? Yeah, you have to vote on this too, special guest.
Yeah, I think I tend to look at data for these sorts of things, and I think the data on a lot of these topics is pretty weak. And so, fundamentally, it's really interesting to see what's the discourse versus what's the reality, and what's actually causing teenage depression, and what there's a lot of other stuff I think to unpack more broadly.
You think the data is weak around this? What about it is weak?
Like the impact of social products on different classes of teens by age and gender. And so, if you look at that, there's all sorts of other effects in the mix for depending on which slice you choose. So
I think that's totally true. I just want my kids to go to school to learn, not scroll Instagram, right?
Sure.
I think that is a great point as it relates to the broader debate, and something I'm curious about, hiring a reporter to solely cover this issue, because that's what I do when I'm interested in an issue. But I also think, if we can't agree on the school issue, with an exception for reaching your parents or something, I find that tough.
I think there's also, what do you support as a parent, and then what do you want to regulate, and how do you want to regulate it?
Yeah, I guess that's fair. I am so more in favor of very aggressive guardrails on this.
Look, I'm old enough to remember when I had my first job out of college at Bain & Company, Facebook was originally banned on you couldn't use it in the office, right?
Remember you had that phone that had your email, but it was 2 lines. Remember that?
Yeah, I used to check my email on my flip phone after class, right? I had that
in class, Sam. I was there.
In class, fine.
Yeah.
When Elad was doing this stuff, at Google, I was working at AT&T mobile mobility over the summers, working on you call a phone number and Shazam songs with whatever it was. This stuff is but it was interesting. Again, my first job out of college, all this social media stuff was banned in the office because why would it's just a waste of time, right? You're there to work, right? And those things all folded with Apple, right? The iPhone kind of shot all that in the foot and it all fell apart. I think it's perfectly reasonable. So I wouldn't let our kids have phones in class, but I also think, to Elad's point, the data isn't incredibly strong. It gets used in a lot of different ways. And I do think there's a real question about what regulations we should be placing on schools, et cetera, et cetera. I'm generally in favor of more regulation.
Dave.
I disagree. I think the data is abundantly clear. The science is pretty hard. It's really good science. And the science says that I think we're doing irreparable harm to an entire generation, and that it's a national mental health emergency, and that we have to do something. Otherwise, our kids are all at risk of eating disorders is the middle outcome, and suicide is the worst outcome. And I think that we just have a responsibility as parents to recognize this and to do something.
Have you guys read Bad Therapy?
Oh my God. Now we're this is a parenting podcast.
Oh,
okay. Quickly. Then we're going back to VC.
3 tips to deal with your toddler throwing a tantrum. I'm happy to pine on that.
Yeah.
That's in Bad Therapy.
Yeah. And just to finish my point, I actually think that irrespective of your views on the science or the data, I think this is a movement. I've said this a few times on the podcast. And I think when there's a lot of people who are looking for a solution to something and there isn't one, that things can change extremely quickly. And I said that 3 months ago, and I think it's starting to happen.
It seems that way.
I think we should expect this to become a national movement very quickly, because I think parents are panicking.
To wrap this point before we want to wrap with a final topic on where VC is kind of overall. But I don't know if you guys remember, but maybe 5 years ago at Davos, Benioff made this comparison between cigarettes and social media. And I remember thinking wow, that's extreme, right? My own reaction to that was sort of, why is he trying to piss everyone off, right? And then I don't think it's a black or white issue, but to just track how much I think the reaction to now kind of exactly the same.
Well, can I point out a better example? Dave and I both worked at Apple back in the day, and I remember the town hall that Steve spoke at in like 07, 08, where he specifically pointed out that Facebook was going to be seen the equivalent of cigarettes, and like how prescient was that, almost 20
I
years
think it's
ago.
okay to like compare this to, look, adults drink alcohol. Adults get to choose about consuming media and substances which we know to be harmful, right? And this is a question about kids in my mind. And how do we help and protect our children?
Look,
right?
I have to imagine, but here's the thing. Let's bring this back to AI for a second. It's like, look, our kids don't have phones. They're not going to. And they're going to get like black and white flip phones when they do for emergencies. Like, I'm not, like, I'm with you as a parent. I think it's a question of like what level you want to regulate some of this stuff at. And then also like who you push on. Like, look, the reality is the interesting thing about the world is the more consolidated power is into $3 trillion companies, the easier it is to like pick out targets and then have these like blanket policies at scale. Like this is kind of a states' rights versus like federal government style. Like who do you want making policy and how do you want it set up? I mean, from my perspective, the Steve Jobs thing has always been a little bit rich because Apple's always been the company with the ultimate control over a lot of this stuff. And they've chosen to like point the finger at others, like versus just deal with it themselves. Right. Like on the same time to bring it to AI, look, you think that social media is a problem? Wait until you have a fanciful character that knows you incredibly well and everything about you and is like your kid's best friend, but is like a fantasy made up character, which by the way, will 1000%
coming
happen.
soon. Yeah.
Like,
for sure.
And by the way, like wait until adults, like right now we have a problem where like marriage is on the decline because Tinder has made sex too accessible, right? Like wait until like a generation of men that it's not porn and Tinder. It's just like your perfect AI girlfriend companion. And like you destroy human relationships. Like
it's right though.
Well, like this is just what's going to happen.
Jess, would you care if Sam had an AI girlfriend?
Yes, you would. And I wouldn't.
I don't know if I'd care if Dave did.
Oh my God.
Good to know.
But the basic point is like, there's a real interesting thing, which is like, we've basically, because of the consolidation of control of some of this stuff, unlike the internet, which is relatively decentralized, relatively less than it probably should be, we've just created these like fatty targets for like regulating things at like national or even international scale. And like there shouldn't be one answer. Like there should be a diversity of answers. So I really think this is a very complicated set of issues about who you go after and how you set it up and what do you want to be saying nationally, blah, 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 blah. And that is completely separate from the question of what the technology will deliver, what human beings want, and then how we'll treat our own kids, right? Like, which I think is very different.